Exactly. So the reason I wanted to have you on, Ty, obviously, the subscriptions to golongtd.com. By the way, perfect Father's Day gift if you want to get a jump on that ahead of the summer as well. How about that? You did a little bit of a piece after the Giants had, their initial whammy week, which was getting the Daniel Jones deal done at the deadline, tagging Saquon, and then attacking free agency, I thought very smartly, waiting for the linebacker market on that first day to come to them with Bobby Okereke, eventually trading for Darren Waller, not necessarily opening up the wallet for a big-time wide receiver, but they still get a big-time pass catcher. Before we break down every move like that, I set that up to say Giants fans might remember you because you really had the true takedown piece from outside the inner New York City market on the end of the Dave Gettleman era. It was a multiple part series you did in golongtd.com on basically how the heck the Giants went from this Super Bowl champion traditional organization to one of the worst run organizations in football. It is amazing that basically a year and a half later, the Giants are coming off of a playoff win and very active, but not stupidly active in the free agency market and building the team in the right way. So let me just start with this, Tyler. Off of writing that original piece a year and a half ago, seeing what you're writing now about the Giants, are even you surprised at how quickly they have turned this thing around?
I would have been stunned, floored. I would not have believed you for a split second if you told me this, right then, a year ago, after those stories came out. But when they hired Joe Shoen and then they hired Brian Dable, and these are, living here in Buffalo, having somewhat of an intimate knowledge on both individuals and just how they kind of went about the process of drafting Josh Allen through Shoen, how they went about the process of developing Josh Allen with Dable. I am not surprised, to be honest. I mean, I was stunned that they actually thought outside of the organization, because that's been the problem, right? It's so incestual, and it's just kind of a friend of a friend or somebody with a tie to ownership that's kind of – even Gettleman is – the retread of all retreads to bring him back. Gettleman outside figures was huge.
Gettleman counts his Super Bowl rings when he was basically like an assistant office scout. So that's all you need to know about that. Those count as his Super Bowl rings that he's earned. But yes,
are they right next to the right next to that asshole sign on his desk, right?
Exactly. No, exactly. But yeah, it's amazing. And by the way, some of the names they brought in, it's funny to look back. Ryan Poles, who's now the general manager of the Bears, who might be having a home run offseason. I bring that up. This Adrian Wilson was another guy. Kind of the names you saw go around. Austin Fort, too, was another guy they brought in. These were all the names that they interviewed outside for general manager. And it's kind of crazy to see all those guys doing good work now, which makes me feel like the Giants hit a home run with Joe Shoen, but they might have been all right either way if you look at the job all those guys are doing. But anyway, Shoen plays the first season really smart here. Clearly, Dable is an animal of a coach, getting the most out of nothing. But it was really funny when the Giants got the deal done with Daniel Jones, Ty, because Joe Shoen, one of the first things he said in his press conference when the deal got done was, essentially last year there were guys that they wanted to bring in, even bottom of the barrel guys that they simply couldn't afford. That's how tight Gettleman had left the cap. And to be able to do what they did, despite being that tight, just speaks to, you can almost argue made Joe Shoen, on the fly become a better GM, the gymnastics he had to do while a team was in contention.
That's where that Bills experience really came in handy. I know Joe has spoken about it with the locals out there, but early on in those Bills days, the salary cap was in a pretty rough place too, and they really had to work that waiver wire. Isaiah McKenzie, who I did a podcast with here in town, he was one of those waiver wire pickups that ended up sticking around for 5 years. So what did they do? They found Isaiah's best friend in Orchard Park, New York, Isaiah Hodgins, and he has a big year for them. That's what they were forced to do. Those were the acquisitions. It was, Kmart, DVD bin, $5 for 10, anything they could get on the cheap.
The corpse of Landon Collins. Right, exactly.
Right, the corpse. And then to make the playoffs, to win a playoff game, it speaks to everybody that's in charge there, number one. But I just love, not to get ahead of ourselves here, but I just love Joe Shoen really giving Daniel Jones a full year of evaluation here. It would be really easy for him to come in. And the number one reason I love to hire Shaun is this is somebody who has basically lived out of a Marriott scouting games for the last 2 decades. His whole young adult life. as he builds a family. I mean, he spoke to Matthew Fairburn, a buddy of mine, for a story at The Athletic a few years. He went on a scouting trip with him. And I mean, he's missing like youth championships and birthdays, all this stuff, because he's so devoted. You need somebody who's had their eyeballs on players. And it sounds simple, but the Giants were pretty close to hiring a GM who was, I mean, I'm sure he's very good with the cap, but Abrams is not somebody who is, it's come up through the scouting world like a Joe Shoen. That's what they needed. And young and fresh and bringing innovative ideas. So for him to come in after sacrificing so much, somebody gets this job. I think that temptation to want to bring in your guy, your quarterback, clean house, man, it's got to be so strong. And we see it all the time. So for him to just kind of tap the brakes, give Daniel Jones a full year, and then evaluate him from day one all the way through those 2 playoff games, and then reach the contract, the compromise that they did, which, as you know, as a Giants follower, Giants fan, it is pretty team friendly. I mean, it's the perfect compromise. Yeah. It speaks to his level-headedness as a GM. I mean, I think that they're in great hands.
Ty, you've literally, this is why you're great at radio, because you've also just set up my next follow-up question. So before we get to the ins and outs of what you like about the Daniel Jones deal, because you also had a Daniel Jones piece at golongtd.com towards the end of the year, which I believe was pre-playoff win as well. Let me just say this. What you just hit on Shane is something that I don't think is being written about or talked about enough. And I think every Giant fan worth the salt would have agreed you did not need to pick up Daniel Jones' 5th-year option. And if it wasn't about talent, it was certainly about injury. He was a guy who was banged up for 2 years in a row, and you might as well roll the dice. But what we've seen and what we've grown accustomed to, Daniel Jones is the first guy with that 5th-year option decline to get a second deal with a team. It's not just Daniel Jones now as well, Tyler. You may not be, aware of this, or maybe you are, but Darius Slayton is a guy Giant fans love, okay? Well, or love to hate at times. He has a drop issue, but he could be a burner on the outside, but he was one of our own, right? Drafted by the Giants out of Auburn in the 5th round, one of the Gettleman picks that stuck around. He was a guy left for dead on the Giants roster in August, okay? He was going to be the 6th, maybe 7th receiver. They had to ask him to take a pay cut from $2.5 million to $1 million, or he was going to be flat out cut. He decided to stick around. They tried to trade him. He ends up essentially becoming the Giants' most valuable receiver in the second half of the year when Tony is traded, Galladay. So, Giant fans listening understand this, but he ties into Daniel Jones with this. Joe Shoen, seemingly with Brian Dable, entered their Giants tenures and training camp with the idea Daniel Jones, maybe Saquon Barkley, and for sure Darius Slayton were all not going to be part of the Giants in 2023. They had to get through, let these guys' contracts run out, and they were going to put their own fingerprints on it. I think those guys all coming back for different various prices in any which way, shape, or form is refreshing. Not that the Giants are necessarily keeping their own, but it's refreshing that a regime went into something where they were pretty certain maybe that those guys were gone. For sure, they thought Slayton was gone, but they were willing to be proven wrong. And that's exactly what happened with all 3 of those guys. And to not be stuck and set in your ways, specifically at the general manager spot, I mean, that is such a refreshing approach in the modern NFL, Tyler.
I could not agree more. I mean, egos abound, right? Newsflash, they're everywhere in front offices, on coaching staffs. You don't get to that position of power if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't have a gigantic ego in your own beliefs, your own eyeballs, wanting to get your guys in there. And that's why teams are constantly hitting reset. And usually, I shouldn't say usually, it's about probably 50-50. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It worked in Buffalo. Right, and that's what makes us that much more stunning, Shaun, is when Shane was Brandon Beane's right-hand man, they ended the drought in Buffalo. 17 years in a row, no playoffs. Yeah. They end it with guys like
it's crazy to think that was a drought now because the Bills are in the playoffs every year, but that was a big deal when Andy Dalton basically helped the Bills get in the playoffs that day. It was a huge deal.
Oh my God. At the time, it was one of the greatest moments in Buffalo Bills history. It didn't even involve the Bills. Andy Dalton hitting Tyler Boyd for a touchdown against Baltimore. I mean, I had family members that went out in East Aurora, like a suburb here, just to be out, just to see the reaction. I mean, crying tears of joy as adults. It was a crazy night. But my point being, like, they end the drought with, a lot of players from the previous regime. My podcast co-host Jamonis and Doug Whaley. He was Doug Whaley's right-hand man. A lot of their players, they win 9 games, they get to the playoffs, they lose to Jacksonville, and then what do? They move on from Tyrod, they move on from a lot of these players, they draft Josh Allen over Josh Rosen, which, by the way, Bills fans were really pissed about at the time. If you want to have some fun, go back and find the original Bills tweet when they took Josh Allen.
Right.
They were livid. They were livid.
In college, right? Exactly. By the way, I was livid the Giants took Saquon over Josh Rosen, but still, whatever. We all wanted Josh
I know. I
Rosen.
like. Yeah. It's oh my god. Yeah, because he was the UCLA prototypical tough. We saw him on primetime, all that stuff. But they hit reset. Like they brought in Beasley, John Brown. They started to kind of like try to make the team in their image, started at the quarterback position. So I would think that was probably Joe Schoen's plan. Not to put words in his mouth, but just judging him and the Giants off of their actions year one when they're just trying to survive cap-wise, and they go in there with Daniel Jones. He doesn't have much around him. It's all right. We might win 3-4 games, and then we're going to find our quarterback. Daniel Jones changed those plans, and most importantly, Joe Schoen was open to Daniel Jones changing those plans. So that's where you give me more credit. Like where he came from. I mean, they're not taking the Bills' path. Like they're willing to let this continue on with Daniel Jones, and it's as much a Brian Daboll extension as a Daniel Jones extension. You're just you want to keep
if Daboll doesn't believe in Jones,
going.
right? Exactly. If Daboll doesn't believe in Jones or get him, that's not going to matter either. But it's again, as I just pointed out, their ability now to show, and by the way, show other players, hey, you come here, you prove yourself, you can earn more money down the line. They've now shown this. I mean, Saquon to a lesser extent, but mainly with Slayton and Jones, because of course Saquon hasn't signed. Now let's transition.